Major funding for these programs is made possible by grants from Chase Commercial Term Lending and Capital One Bank, New York Community Bank, the Witkoff Group, M&T Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Genova Burns, Jean Tomasi and Webster, Greenberg Traurig, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company. Additional funding is provided by grants from AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Colliers International NYC, CPEX Real Estate Services, Cushman & Wakefield, Customers Bank, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, Levine Builders, First Nationwide Title Agency, Flushing Bank, Friedman, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, HAP Investments, Herrick Feinstein, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Chairman USRealty.com, John Katsimides, Red Apple Group, Margolin Weiner and Evans, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Matone Group, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, New Banks, People's United Bank, SJP Properties, Sterling & Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the CUNY TV Foundation, the Continuum Company, Urban American, and these friends.
These kids grow up in Staten Island, their relatives immigrate to Staten Island, they go to college in Staten Island, and then they learn, you know, maybe I'll be a school teacher. Then I, forget school teaching, I'll go into personnel, and out of personnel, they get involved with hospitals. They don't get involved in hospitals. They become the president and CEO of the largest hospital in Staten Island, the largest employer, and also the executive director for the North Shore-LIJ. I'm lucky to have Tony Ferreri here. Thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here, Michael. Thank you.
It's really interesting because, your family has roots going back to the hospital, which we'll tell you over there. So tell me about how your grandparents came over here to America.
On my mother's side, it started with my great-grandparents.
Right.
They came from a small town in Italy called Vignadoro. And many people from that little town settled in Staten Island. That's how they found their way to Staten Island. And my great-grandfather came here, and my grandmother was 6 years old. And the only work he could get at the time was as a gravedigger. And many of the men who came from that little town.
You said they worked in the Moravian
Cemetery.
Moravian Cemetery. So that, and this is the grandfather who has the involvement later on with Staten Island.
It's actually his son-in-law, my grandmother's husband, is the grandfather who has experience at the hospital.
Okay, so tell me about the other side, the Sicily side.
My father's family is, my grandfather was from Palermo, and my grandmother was from Corleone, and not that far apart. But they didn't meet until they both met each other here in the United States, and my grandfather on my father's side settled in Harlem on 125th Street.
Harlem at that time had a large Italian and a large Jewish population over there. It was a center of business, was a rising business. One day with a car.
Yeah, my grandfather came here. He was a skilled carpenter, and he came here. And the reason he wound up leaving Harlem and winding up in Staten Island was that there was an incident on the streets of Harlem on 125th Street, and my uncle, who was at the time about 9 years old, was walking with his younger sister, who was about 8 at the time, and they were in the streets, and a car went running by, and guns came out of the car, and someone was shot dead right in front of them on the streets of Manhattan, of Harlem. And they ran home, told my grandfather the story, and he said, "Pack the bags, we're leaving." And back then, Staten Island was farmland. And it was still in New York City, but it was farmland. And he decided a much safer place to raise a family.
So when does he move there?
In 1920.
So he moves there in 1920, and your mother's family was there at the turn of the century.
Correct.
Okay. So let's tell the story about your mother's, your grandfather, that he was a laborer, and one day he has an accident, and he ends up at this small little hospital. I mean, Staten Island University Hospital, going back to the roots, goes back to the late 1870s.
No, 1861, actually.
1861. So what happens in 1929 at the start of the Depression?
Well, this is, for me, a great moment in my life. And I had been the president of the hospital for about 3 years at that point. And the hospital at one point was located in the northern section of Staten Island, not far from the ferry. And it was on Castleton Avenue. And the building of the hospital was shaped in the form of a castle. And they would refer to the hospital as the castle. And I had a nurse manager stop by my office one day, and she had a black trash bag. And it was heavy, and she brought it over to me, and she said, I found this on top of a file cabinet. Now, we had moved from that old location, so somehow this item wound up in a trash bag on top of a file cabinet in a new facility. So I took it in my office, I opened it up, and it was an old hospital register, which, if you think back to the old hotels and the old movies where you see a hotel,
the old big books.
the big book, the register, and you'd open the book and you'd say, sign here. So I opened it up, and it's what it looked like, a hotel registry. And I started looking for names because I'm a fourth generation Staten Islander, and I started looking for surnames that were familiar to me. And after about an hour and a half, because it's a very big book dating from 1928 through 1929, and I came across the name Anthony Serafino, my grandfather. And until he died, I had no idea that he had ever been in a hospital other than the event that eventually led to his death. And I was surprised to see his name there. It was May 17th, 1929, Anthony Serafino, seen in the clinic, in the ward, because obviously back then, if he was seen in a ward, he didn't have money to pay for his care. And it said that, and there was columns all across that said where he was born, where he lived. He was 35 years old. I knew it was him because the address is where my mother was born, on Nugent Street in Staten Island. And then as I went along the page, there were 3 columns on the side as who paid for it. And there was a column that said NYC. So in this brief moment, I learned that my grandfather, who spoke very little English, was a patient in a ward in a clinic, needed surgery, had a hand injury, and this was before the days of penicillin. So he was treated with sulfur, but for an injury to his hand, a cut to his hand, he remained in the hospital for 6 days because it could be deadly without penicillin, of course. And it was before workers' compensation because he was injured on the job. He would have been covered by workers' compensation, but that didn't exist. Medicaid didn't exist at the time. So he was treated by the hospital, and the care was paid for by the city of New York.
So it comes full circle.
Comes full circle, you know, and it's an interesting part of the story is that I happened to be addressing a group of people at a fundraiser, and someone in the audience raised their hand. They wanted to talk about their experience in the emergency room at the hospital, and she said, you know, I pay good money for my health insurance, and I have to go to your emergency room, and I have to stand in line, and I have to wait for hours to be seen because you're seeing people who don't have insurance, and you're seeing people who are undocumented aliens. And she said, I pay for my coverage, I shouldn't have to wait. And I said, let me tell you a story. And I told the story of my grandfather. And that was a message from my grandfather to me about how important it is. Our mission at Staten Island University Hospital, we provide $28 million of charity care a year at our hospital.
So now both sides of the family are living here. You told me, how did your mother meet your father? And it's some relatives over there, right? Brothers, sisters?
Yeah, you know, I actually have 35 first cousins, so I have a large family. My father had 6 siblings, and my mother had 5 siblings. And my father met my mother because his brother was dating her sister. And they eventually married, so 2 brothers married 2 sisters. And that's how they met, through their siblings.
Now it was Grandpa who went into the business originally, or your father with the with the bleach?
Yes, and when my grandfather came, my father's father came to Staten Island from after moving his family from Harlem, he decided to learn how to mix bleach. And there was a shanty behind the house, and in that shanty he put a formula together and he mixed bleach. And back in the days before supermarkets, you couldn't walk into a store and buy a bottle of bleach. Back in those days, it was delivered to you by a Javel waterman, is what they were called. You had your milkman, your ice man,
And you had your
coal
bleach man.
and you had a bleach man, and they called him Javel water. So that little business started in 1926. My father, during the Depression, had to leave school and help support his family. So at age 13, he went to work full-time for my grandfather, delivering bleach. And his only time off between age 13 and the day he died at his desk at age 57, died suddenly, his only time off during that period of time was weekends and a 3-year break of combat duty in the South Pacific.
Your mother was working as a switchboard operator, then she's a stay-at-home. You have an older brother, and you go to school. Tell me about growing up in Staten Island when it was farms. There was no, this is before the bridge. The bridge was built when you were 13, so it was a different case. So
Right.
what was it like?
It was two worlds. It was going from a rural Staten Island to a suburban Staten Island. And the rural Staten Island, that until age 13, 14, 15 years old, because it started taking time to develop the borough after the bridge was built, it was a community of about 100,000 people.
Right, you didn't have Staten Island Mall, you didn't have...
No, you didn't have mall. You had little stores. Richmond Avenue was the shops, and that's where you went shopping in these shops. You didn't have anything that you would consider even a shopping center back in those days. And Staten Island, I grew up in a town called Newdorp. We were the only house on our block. I had, my father bought a piece of property. It was a corner piece of property. The rest of the block was woods. It was like growing up upstate New York. And across the street was all developed. So we were the end of the development. And we would go just blocks away. We would ice skate in the winter on the swamps that were located in our neighborhood. During the summer, we would pick punks and use them to light firecrackers on the 4th of July. Staten Island was a very different place. We went to the farmers market on Richmond Avenue, where there were farms spread out all over Staten Island, where we bought fresh produce. We had a drive-in theater. We had a little airport. It was very, very different in those days.
So you go to Catholic school originally, and then you go to Newdorp High School, and then you graduate, and that's a great story about your father. You tell me, because he offers you an opportunity, but he offers your brother the opportunity. Tell the story about that.
Yeah, I didn't realize till years later this was the same kind of negotiating that John Nash won the Nobel Prize for. My dad, as I said, he had to leave school at 13, and he valued an education, and he was determined that all 3 of his sons would get college degrees. And when my brother Joe was just completing Augustinian Academy in Staten Island, and he was accepted to Seton Hall University, and just before he was going off to school, my father sat down with him privately, and he said, "What I'm about to discuss with you is between us. You're never to share this with your brothers." And he said to my brother Joe, he said, "Look, I worked very hard for my money. I didn't finish high school, and I want you to have a college degree. However, I realize the importance of the degree. I also realize that it's going to be very expensive, and I want to know you really want to do this. So if you don't go to college, I'll buy you a brand new Cadillac." And my brother thought about it, and he said, "You know, Dad, I'd rather go to college and 4 years from now buy my own Cadillac." So he said, "Fine." He said, "Now, you can't tell your brothers about this conversation." 2 years later, I was leaving Newdorp High School, getting ready to go to Wagner College, and my father asked to see me privately. We sat down, and he said, "You know, I worked very hard for my money. I want to make sure you really want to do this. If you don't go to school, you don't go to college, I'll buy you a new Cadillac." And I said, "Well, Dad, if I go to college 4 years from now, I'll have a college degree. If I take the Cadillac 4 years from now, I'll have a 4-year-old car." So he said, "Fine." So 5 years pass. My brother graduates Monsignor Farrell High School. goes off to Stevens Tech, completes his degree, becomes an electrical engineer. And while we were celebrating his graduation, my brother Joe thought it was fun that we could tell him this, discuss the story and have a nice laugh over it about what our father had offered us. And we thought Chris had been offered the same deal, but it turns out Chris said he never had that conversation with me. So he went to my father and he said, look, Joe graduated college, you offered him a Cadillac not to go to school. Anthony graduated college, or high school, you offered him a Cadillac not to go to college. So you didn't give me that offer. So my father said, you would have taken the Cadillac.
So you didn't take the Cadillac, you went to Wagner College.
Right.
But in high school you met some young lady, and you wanted to get married, so you finished school in 3.5 years, and you wanted to be a school teacher at that time.
That's
right?
correct.
And it was the height of the Vietnam War. But when you were going to school, you were working for unemployment insurance, right? So,
Correct.
which happens to be fortuitous because it helped your career later on.
Yes.
So what happens after graduating Wagner?
Well, there were no teaching jobs. You know, there was a shortage of job opportunities and a surplus of teachers, especially in secondary education, social studies. So with a degree, I was able to accept a job as a claims examiner at the unemployment office, where I had worked all through college. And that was a provisional appointment that ran out in 2 years. So I went from one side of the unemployment desk to the other side of the unemployment desk. And one of the claims examiners, one of the seasoned claims examiners, said there's a company called Gates McDonald. They're consultants to companies in unemployment insurance, compensation. And I went for an interview, was given a job right away. And I was given a list of clients. I was an account manager, and I had to, as part of my job, I gave conferences, seminars on unemployment compensation, on progressive discipline, and as a result, after one of the presentations I made, a personnel director at Hospital Center at Orange offered me a job as an employment manager, and I said, I don't know anything about employment, and he said, you've been talking about it for the last hour and a half.
So the world is strange. So, you know, from unemployment, Gates McDonald, who was an unemployment consultant, so you get a job at the Hospital Center of Orange, and then from there, another hospital finds you. In Newark, which was in a tough time over there, the United Hospitals, which were the 4 hospitals in Newark.
Correct.
And then somebody meets you who you knew, who was probably one of the best hospitals in the state at that time, or probably one of them in the country, St. Barnabas. What happens there?
Well, I was called by Ron Del Moro, who was the VP, but now we're calling it Human Resources and not personnel any longer. Ron Del Moro was the VP for HR at St. Barnabas in Livingston, New Jersey, the finest hospital in New Jersey. And Ron said he would be moving up to CEO of the hospital, and he wanted me to come on board to replace him as VP for HR. And this, from my vantage point, was an excellent opportunity, because now I'm moving into the largest hospital in the state, the most prestigious hospital in the state, and I would be becoming part of that administration. So I accepted the job, and it turned out to be a very good career move for me. And but one of the things that you find when you work in this business, and my kids are grown now, so I don't mind so much being away from home, than putting in the 12, 14-hour days, working nights, weekends. But back then, my kids were 5, 7 years old, and I wasn't seeing them. So I thought the best path for me to take at that point was to go into my own business and have the opportunity to manage my son's baseball team, or go to my daughter's dance lessons, and spend time with my kids.
So what happens? One day you're leaving work and you pass this new town in Edison, New Jersey, Metro Park.
And it actually was a new development in terms of office buildings. It was right off
4-story office building,
right
off the highway.
Right near Metro Park train station, which is now becoming a hub for travel from Manhattan to Metro Park, and then on to Washington or north to Boston. And Metro Park was one of the stops. So a lot of large companies came to that area, and they were renting office buildings. And as I'm driving by trying to decide what kind of a business to go into, I passed the Metro Park, saw all the new construction, drove around the area and saw 4 lease signs everywhere and just said, Metro Temp has a ring to it. And I decided to go into the staffing business, temporary staffing.
So you start on the staffing, and since you, with the Barnabas and the other hospitals, you had known a lot bit about hospitals, so you're doing hospital staffing, nurse staffing, and you're building the business with a couple of things, and then you went into the home health care also.
Right. There was a nursing shortage when I started the staffing business. And over a period of time, it's ebb and tides with the staffing, especially the nursing shortage. While it's existed in most of the decades over the last 6 decades, there's periods of times when there is a surplus of nurses, and I needed to subsidize the staffing business, so I decided to go into home care, and eventually had 6 branches, 6 in New Jersey and 1 in Staten Island.
Now, what's interesting is when you're doing this, you get involved with Staten Island University Hospital, but as a lay leader now. So how'd that happen?
Friends of mine who were on the board approached me, and they felt that it would, because it's a very complicated business, as you know, having served on the board of a hospital yourself. It's a very complicated business, and friends of mine who were on the board came to me and said, we'd really like to have a trustee who knows the hospital business, and asked me if I wouldn't mind joining the board. And in April of 1995, I joined Staten Island University Hospital's board.
So you're on the board, you're selling the home health care division of Metro Temps, and what happens in, what year is it, 2001?
2001.
2001.
The CEO of the hospital, Anthony Ferreri, asked if I would be interested in joining his administration, because he was looking for someone who had a background in hospital administration, but also had experience on the entrepreneurial side, because the hospital had been involved in some for-profit ventures that he wanted me to head up. And I really didn't hesitate much. I had missed working in a hospital, and this was an opportunity to get back in, and especially that I'd be getting into a hospital that serves my own community.
So that's 2001, and then in 2003, what happens?
Andy retires. I'm appointed as the interim CEO while they conduct a search. And during that period of time, after 6 months, the board and the North Shore system decided to appoint me as the permanent CEO.
We'll continue talking about the job, but I think it's really important to talk about what happened in health over there. You've learned firsthand about health. Mm-hmm. What happened about 2 years ago?
I've had an interesting experience, you might say, and I 2 years ago actually it's only a year ago that I was diagnosed. It was February 20th of 2013 that I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And
now you had a growth going back years ago, you said?
Yes. Actually, it was discovered during a pre-employment physical at United Hospitals. So I can pinpoint the exact time. It was 1978. And the physician noticed I had a cyst in this area near my armpit. And he said he was sure it was nothing, not to worry about it. And over the years, I always knew it was there, and it got larger and larger. And every time I had a physical, I would ask the physician about it, and he would say, "How long have you had it?" And I would tell him. He said, "It's nothing." And last year, in January 2013, it began to become very sensitive to the touch, and it had grown to the size of a golf ball. But because it was in the area of my armpit, it wasn't noticeable, except I knew it was there. And so I went to a surgeon, and actually had a friend who said, who had breast cancer herself, who said, "Look, it doesn't belong there. You should just get it out. Even if it is nothing, you should just get it out." So I went to a surgeon, and the surgeon agreed, and he said that, "Look, I agree with your primary care doctor. It's nothing. It's been there for over 30 years. He said, "But it doesn't belong there. Let's remove it." So he removed it, and on February 20th, he got the results back from the specimen, and it was cancer. Stage 2A breast cancer. And I had to had to have a second procedure to operate around the margins, remove lymph nodes, and then begin chemotherapy, followed by radiation. I have to tell you the good news, it's a cure, but it's grueling. Chemotherapy is a grueling experience.
It's a grueling experience, and in addition, at that time, you took an added responsibility at the hospital.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that added responsibility.
Shortly after I was diagnosed, it was still February, as a matter of fact, so it was only a few days later. I had met with Michael Dowling, who's the CEO of the North Shore System, and Michael said he wanted me to take on a role of a regional executive director that would now include not just Staten Island, but also Manhattan. And with that comes responsibility for Lenox Hill, for Manhattan Ioneer, and for the development of a new freestanding emergency room downtown, the site of the old St. Vincent's Medical Center. At first, again, it was an interim appointment because I was about to undergo chemotherapy, and without wanting to put pressure on me, I think Michael felt best if I took the role as interim. This way, if I needed to step down, I could. But I was determined, and I've only missed 5 days of work in all of that time, even at the sickest point of the chemotherapy. So at some point soon after that, Michael decided that there was no holding me back, and that I would not be defeated by this disease. And I'm fortunate that he decided to give me the permanent appointment as regent.
And needless to say, and you are treated and taken care of at Staten Island University Hospital, which is part of the North Shore-LIJ system.
That's right.
Which today you're also doing. What else are you doing now?
Michael also has asked me more recently to represent the system and lead the initiatives relative to bringing in new affiliates, new groups and hospitals into relationships with the North Shore-LIJ health system. And those relationships could be simple affiliations, clinical affiliations, or they could be absolute mergers where hospitals come into the system.
Let's talk about family. You married over 40 years?
42 years.
Your wife's name is?
Michelle.
Okay. You have a daughter and a son.
Tony and Joseph.
Tony married to who?
Her husband's Michael Spinella.
Now, Tony, they gave birth to a child, and the child in the same way was born at Staten Island University Hospital.
Right. And I've made this point, and it wasn't something that I thought about. It happened to come out in an interview, and it really. And most interviews I don't prepare for, I simply just speak extemporaneously. But I was thinking about it during this interview, talking about the importance of my role in the community and running the hospital. And I said, you know, how many people have an opportunity where they're CEO of a hospital that treated grandfather and grandson?
Right. And the name of your grandson?
Michael.
Okay, and then you have your other son.
My son is Joseph.
And Joseph is doing what now?
He's an assistant dean at Moore Catholic High School.
So, I mean, you know, for the people, you know, fourth generation Staten Islander, you lived your life and you continue to live your life for Staten Island and the community, and I'm really happy you were here today. Thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.